Bienvenue tout le monde. Welcome to the press conference hosted by CIC, CanWatch, and Global Canada to release the results of Foreign Policy by Canadians. Bienvenue à cette conférence de presse organisée par le Conseil international du Canada, Canada Global et CAN-SFE pour partager les résultats de notre exercice de démocratie délibérative. Juste quelques notes administratives avant de commencer. Je m'appelle Ben Rosewell, je suis président et directeur de recherche au CIC basé à Toronto. Nous allons commencer dans quelques minutes. Je serai aussi le modérateur de l'événement. Si vous avez des questions à poser, n'importe qui des personnes que vous voyez en vidéo en ce moment, écrivez votre nom et votre agence de médias dans le chat et nous allons, vous n'avez pas besoin d'écrire la question, juste qui vous êtes et qui vous représentez, et on va vous ajouter à la queue. I'll be moderating the discussion today, so any journalists joining us, I would ask that you write your name and your media agency in the chat line. Do not write your question. We'll just start a speaker's queue, and we'll be calling on you in the order that you list yourselves there. As I explained in French, I'm Ben Rosewell, the president and research director of the CIC. I'll be introducing our other panelists very shortly. Let me start, of course, with a recognition of the lands on which we are located. I am based in Toronto, so I'll read those relevant to this city. We in the CIC, CanWatch, and Global recognize that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and that Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I'd also like to mention this is not simply a land acknowledgement for us. This reality is reflected as well as we possibly could, I believe, in the exercise that we have done, that the reality of the debt that we owe to the people that have taken care of this land for all these years is integral to the work that we do in representing the voices of Canadians in foreign policy, and we're deeply grateful, particularly at this historic moment as we're coming to terms with the past of this land. Now, we have sent the results for this exercise in deliberative democracy by email. It points to a URL, which we have just in the process of fixing. It should be any second now. I would invite you to visit, to check your emails to see the conclusions that we have written that convey the results from that. Je vous invite à consulter vos courriels pour le rapport final que nous venons d'envoyer. Pour le consulter, vous aurez accès à tous les chiffres que nous allons partager, ainsi que les conclusions et les implications pour la politique étrangère du Canada. We are very pleased to have gathered today to share these results with you. We're particularly honored to have co-chairs of our Champions Group of Foreign Policy by Canadians, a group of very senior former practitioners, either of politics or in the senior ranks of the civil service, who have spent their career at the intersection between the people of Canada and the policies that our government passes to advance their interests. The co-chairs of this Champions Group are Anne McClellan, former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, joining us from Edmonton today. We're very pleased to have Anne with us. And then joining from a little closer to my home, Lisa Raitt, former Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. We're deeply indebted to all the champions. I mentioned that we also had Jean Augustine, Margaret Biggs, Marie-Lucie Morin, Christian Paradis, Ted Menzies, and Hélène Laverdière in the Champions Group, meeting with us throughout to make sure that this exercise represented all perspectives in Canada and spoke to all perspectives in Canada. Make sure that this was as non-partisan and objective as possible. Big thanks to the champions. Our partners in this exercise, the Canadian International Council, which I represent, is a 93-year-old organization with branches in 18 cities focused on foreign policy. We were very honored to be joined by CanWatch, the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, and its very talented CEO, Julia Anderson, who really made this possible in so many ways. CanWatch is one of the largest organizations in the development assistance space in Canada, focused obviously on women and children's health, but it plays a leadership role across the entire sector and indeed in foreign policy. And then there's Global Canada, led by Robert Greenhill, who joins us from Montreal today, an organization which has been tireless in its advocacy of the role that Canada can play in the world, not only in development, but in international affairs more generally. And we're very, very honored to have had the partnership of Global Canada. Our three organizations, CIC, Global Canada, and CanWatch, gathered about 2 years ago. This is the genesis of Foreign Policy by Canadians. We took stock, along with many other members of the foreign policy community, people that have devoted their lives and their careers to advancing Canada's interests and values on the world stage, to take stock of where Canada was on the 100th anniversary of the de facto independent foreign policy of Canada in 2019. The collective view in the room was that we are not occupying the same role of leadership and prominence that we once did. The impact that Canada has had throughout this past century is needed now more than ever. And we concluded that the path to unlocking the potential that Canada has in its international affairs lay in Canadians themselves, Canadians ourselves. That anytime when Canada has transformed its foreign policy in the past and risen to the challenges of a changing world order, has been in lockstep between government and citizens. And so we set out to try and strengthen the bridge between government and citizens. And we did so through an innovative approach of engaging a representative sample of the entire population of Canada, not the groups that are quite frequently in contact with government, but literally everyday Canadians. The people that you meet at the bus stop, the people that your neighbors when you go visit your favorite aunt or uncle, everyday Canadians from coast to coast, urban and rural, English and French, white, Black, Asian, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, every single province, at least some from the territories, not many, but we have a sample that literally looks like Canada, a microcosm of the nation. We brought them together for between 8 and 12 hours of deliberation on foreign policy issues, on topics that are sometimes assumed to be beyond the experience or the understanding of everyday citizens. I believe we proved them quite dramatically wrong. We showed that citizens were quite intensely interested, recognized the links that our everyday interests have with what happens beyond our borders, and showed a great deal of passion. We managed to gather a sample of 444 Canadians, making this the largest deliberative democracy exercise in Canadian history. I will be turning to my colleagues for the substantive results, but there's one that I'd like to share just off the bat, which I think we all found particularly encouraging. And that is in the process of spending 8 to 12 hours face-to-face with people from across the country, many of whom disagree with us, and naturally, as we see with fellow citizens, the faith that Canadians have in one another, our tolerance for the views of others, and our respect for the positions that others have, even when we don't share them, grew dramatically. And the one stat that I'll share before I turn over is that faith in Canadian democracy rose an astounding 11%. At the end of the poll, we asked, how well do you think the institutions of Canadian democracy are operating? And a full 80% of Canadians, 4 out of 5 Canadians said yes, after having participated in this remarkable act of citizenship. So that is Foreign Policy by Canadians. I will now turn to Anne McClellan for some observations on this exercise and what we've learned. Anne, over to you.
Merci, Ben. Bonjour tous et toutes. It's wonderful to be able to join you, Lisa, Julia, Robert, and Jim to release the findings of this innovative exercise in democracy. When I was first approached by the lead partners for Foreign Policy by Canadians to join and co-chair a group of former senior parliamentarians and public servants to advise on this project, to say the least, I was intrigued. Foreign policy, as we know, is not always the first subject for discussion around the kitchen table, but as leaders, we know how important it is to the lives of Canadians. The prospect of bringing together hundreds of Canadians, representative of Canada's population, briefing them on complex yet important Canadian foreign policy issues, letting them explore, debate, and talk about those issues among themselves, and seeing if and how their views might change after those deliberations is fascinating. And let me say that the findings were even more so. As someone who has spent so much of my career and life listening to Canadians' views and trying to understand and represent them in Parliament, I was excited at how this deliberative democracy exercise could demonstrate how Canadians from all walks of life can contribute to civil public discourse and policy making in Canada. This was a unique opportunity to go beyond traditional public opinion polling research. We know that for most Canadians living busy lives, when confronted with literally hundreds of public policy issues, that it can be challenging for them to develop and provide deeply informed opinions. Foreign Policy by Canadians has proven that when given the opportunity, unbiased information, and an effective platform, citizens are keenly engaged in Canadian affairs and the world around us. This runs contrary to some concerns about widespread citizen apathy. Canadians care. They really do care, and this exercise showed that. They care about these foreign policy issues. But the deliberation discussions also demonstrated they care about Canadian public policy generally and have a keen interest in Canada's future. The deliberations themselves were, for me, and I think for all of us, incredibly heartening. The participants took their roles in this exercise seriously. They asked questions, they debated, they disagreed, they dove deeper, and when all was said and done, as Ben has just told you, they felt better about the state of Canada's democracy, a lot better. This is an important lesson for all of us engaged in the public policy domain, and dare I say, for those of you who cover it in the news, that average Canadian citizens are a rich resource to inform public policy making. We just need to offer them more opportunities like this. And I am hopeful that we will see more of these deliberative exercises and that governments and policymakers will become thirsty for the informed and considered opinions of Canadians, like those who participated in Foreign Policy by Canadians. I am personally looking forward to seeing this type of initiative happen again. I believe that no matter how difficult the issue, that Canadians, with the support of a process like this, are the best positioned to tackle them. Thank you. Merci. Over to you, Lisa.
Well, thanks very much, Anne. And I agree completely with everything you just said off the top. And I would only add that I want to thank personally those 444 participants in giving us all of their time and all of their thought process to sit down and talk about Canadian foreign policy for the amount of time that they did. I mean, they're the heroes. They're the ones that gave us all this time so that we can have this wonderful conversation. And I can tell you, it's been a very rewarding experience for me to be involved in Foreign Policy by Canadians. And so like Anne, when the lead partners actually reached out to me and said, would you be interested? I said, yeah, count me in. And that's even before I knew and understood that I'd be surrounded by so many awesome former parliamentarians of all different partisan stripes. So the initiative and the process to the findings it's really a good news story about Canada and Canadians, because let's face it, these are really challenging times in public discourse, both globally, here at home. Discussion and perspectives have become very polarized, sometimes problematic, especially in digital spaces. But Canadians showed in this exercise that they're surprisingly aligned, and even strongly so, on many different issues. We have some very serious issues to face as a nation, so it's important to engage with both respect and with civility. And in this project, we saw that Canadians really are more than willing to do that. So with Canada Day just around the corner, it's really fitting that we see uniquely Canadian results for this deliberative democracy exercise compared to others that Stanford has conducted around the world. Specifically, when it came to asking what the Canadian deliberators thought about those with whom they strongly disagree, they became even more welcoming after deliberations. And Stanford tells us that this was not always the case in other deliberative polling exercises that they have undertaken around the world. When asked about people they disagree with strongly on issues, these Canadians demonstrated greater respect, understanding, and tolerance, and as well as a willingness to find compromise to solutions that they could both support. In comparison to a similar exercise in the US, Stanford observed that participants retained negative views overall of those with whom they disagreed with, even after deliberation. And those who observed those small group discussions throughout the deliberations will tell you that the spirit of collaborative and civil discourse was prevalent. In the end, almost 3/4 of participants said that they learned a lot about people very different from themselves, and 97% found the deliberations valuable. Imagine what we can do if this type of exercise is informed, respectful discourse could be repeated across other issues. Not only do we get to hear the informed views of average citizens, but remember, those 444 participants likely talk to their families and their friends about their experience. Those are the same participants whose faith in our democracy rose significantly, and that's thanks to foreign policy by Canadians. That's kind of good news for me, and I think uplifting experiences that Canadians want to and need to share in right now. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Ben.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you, Anne. We've mentioned several times the innovative method that we've had for foreign policy by Canadians. For that, we have to thank Professor Jim Fishkin, who's joined us from Stanford University today. I should mention he will be available for any questions that journalists might have on this particular method and why it's a powerful way to reach members of an entire population, how it's possible to take a small group of still 440 people is not 38 million, but how that can show you a really highly accurate image of what the full nation actually believes. Jim Fishkin has been at this for, I think we calculated 27 years since 1994, and this was his first time bringing this method to Canada. But with this, I will now turn to my partners to share the results. The agenda that we put to Canadians included many areas of foreign policy, not all, obviously, but through a grassroots process, we selected 4 broad areas that were very much on the minds of Canadians. And so I will turn to Julia to share some of the reflections on the questions we posed to Canadians on how Canada should engage in the world, uphold first the health of Canadians, and second, the dignity of Canadians. Over to you, Julia.
Thanks so much, Ben and Anne and Lisa, for your insightful comments. I mean, for me, it was so fascinating that the process of deliberation is self-moderated. It's people engaging in conversation. You don't have facilitators. You don't have it's a self-moderator, has a virtual moderator on the platform. So that deep engagement allowed participants to really get into some of the nuance. And we at CanWatch have undertaken a fair bit of polling, and polling is great to give you a snapshot in time, a moment where you see where Canadians are at, but it doesn't give you the why, and it doesn't give you a deeper understanding of where that opinion is coming from and what kinds of argumentation shift that opinion from one way to the other. So of course, all this exercise was undertaken in the context of COVID-19. We were right in the thick when the deliberations were taking place of borders being shut down. The vaccine campaign was not yet where it is now. wasn't up and running. It was sort of slowly moving along. So we know that this was top of mind for Canadians. And for us who work in the global health space, what a great opportunity to try to link and understand if Canadians are seeing the link between what's taking place domestically with COVID-19 and other issues, and what's happening on the international front. And I think we concluded from this exercise as a number one takeaway that Canadians do get it. They understand that pathogens raging around the rest of the world are going to make their ways into the border, and they translate this understanding to other issues within foreign policy as well, to their day-to-day lives, as Ben was speaking to. So we saw this desire in terms of the results for a consistent and decisive action to be taken, sort of strong action with a good dose of humility as well. Majority of Canadians supported the idea of the World Health Organization having stronger ability to inspect countries. We saw a strong desire for borders to be shut down, to close it down, again, in that moment where Canadians were really thinking about what was going in and out. We saw sort of a contradictory, and I think this gets at some of the nuance that can be explored through this process, perspective in Canadians were hesitant to share vaccines. We still had a majority of support, so over 50%, but they did understand that Canada's global health recovery, as well as Canada's economic recovery was inherently linked to what was going on around the world. So that was a really interesting, they understand the why of investing and potentially sharing vaccines, but they weren't necessarily bought into the methodology of sharing right away. And it would be fascinating to retest that now when vaccines are more plentiful in Canada. So we heard many things, and as we were listening to the conversations, we saw that Canadians were discontented overall with how various bodies handled the pandemic. So this ranged from the World Health Organization to the provincial and federal government. They felt like we just need to do more, we need to dig into this issue. But at the same time, there wasn't a desire to upend and kind of find or form a new World Health Organization. 2 out of 3 Canadians endorsed increasing finances to the World Health Organization, in fact, and to giving more power to it, to giving more power to government to shut down borders and to do things. So again, this theme of really decisive action came out over and over again. And an interest in some of that moral leadership that Canada has taken when it comes to the role of Canada in supporting women and children and global health and their health around the world. And you saw Canadians saying that there was sort of a significant need to do this with a lot of humility. Canada doesn't need to be flag waving and leading. It needs to do its part and it needs to contribute. And that's across all kind of the official development assistance indicators. On the human dignity section, I mean, this was really us putting out this strong a recognition of Canada's leadership over the course of a long history in building up and supporting social movements around the world, from landmines to South African apartheid, to the takedown of South African apartheid. Canada has played this role, and we were really testing whether Canadians believe this was still an important role for Canada to be playing. And again, we saw strong majority support, but again, a kind of a desire to say this isn't about getting up onto a world stage and telling what countries want to do. It's about being consistent as Canadians. That means that if our private sector businesses are overseas, they need to act with the kind of integrity that is demanded by Canadians here at home. That means that if Canada is getting up on a world stage and saying it wants to be a leader in global women and children's health, it needs to be doing that here at home. So that kind of consistency of messaging that what we do here, we do there. And there is no kind of double standards. And we need to really uphold human rights here, but also translate that across all of our foreign policy. And just a final tidbit that I couldn't not mention because I found it so fascinating. I'm part of the international development community, and we've of course had the Feminist International Assistance Policy, the FIAP launched. So we asked Canadians what they thought about a feminist foreign policy. And I expected a lot of kind of pushback on the word feminist coming out. What we saw that even across liberals, conservatives, and all parties, once we explained the underpinning understanding of what we meant by feminist, the underpinning equality of building up infrastructure that works for all around the world, everyone crossed over that majority support line saying, yes, if that's what you mean, if that's what you're talking about, I can get behind that. The word was clearly, caused some reactions, but people still got behind the purpose, no matter what stripe of political party you were. So I found that really fascinating personally, that this exercise of simply knowing more, of simply understanding better the issues, can bring you into a supportive position and can actually allow you to deliberate what is the problem you see with that word, what do you mean and what don't you mean. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Ben.
Thank you so much. Well, let me pass on to Robert for the other two major topics on security and prosperity.
Well, thank you, Ben, and good morning, everybody. On security, the results were high amongst a number of different categories, and I'll put them in order of from the very highest to less high: digital security, Arctic security, human security, and collective security. Digital security, ensuring that Canadian elections were free from external digital interference, dealing with the economic implications of cyber threats, weighed very highly. In fact, the issue of illicit cybersecurity and having stronger actions to deal with that was supported by 93% of participants. And one of the things we looked at in addition to the percentage support was how heavily they believed in this on a scale of 1 to 10. And the average on cyber issues and cyber threats was 8.7 out of 10. So Canadians are very aware of the external threat to economic and democratic well-being coming from cyber. The second that actually came up very strongly was on the issue of the Arctic, both from a security perspective, but also more broadly in terms of human security and supporting the Inuit communities and other northern communities, and in a more engaged fashion. So they didn't see any trade-off between investing in the military to safeguard Canada's presence in the north and providing for the social and economic well-being of the inhabitants. But both these elements actually ranked amongst the top 10 out of the proposals put forward to participants to vote on. On the issue of human security, that can really be subdivided into two areas: the health security, which Julia has mentioned, and which was obviously top of mind for people with the issues of COVID. 84% wanted to maintain travel restrictions until the overwhelming majority of Canadians were vaccinated. On the other hand, 2/3 believed that it was important for us to be investing in the health of developing countries as part of a measure of supporting our own health. Certainly, COVID underlined just how inseparable Canadians' health security and the world's health security is. The other element of human security, of course, was on climate change, where 72% supported it being an issue where it should be seen as a question of national security, as well as just economic importance. Then finally, if we look at the issue of collective security, one of the key questions that has come up recently is, should there be an alliance of liberal democracies to deal with the growing influence and engagement of China and Russia and other more authoritarian states? And there are some 69% of Canadians who were in favor of some actions, but as is noted in our report, the sense really was collective engagement, yes, but a new Cold War, no, to make sure we have a balanced approach. That element of a balanced approach was also seen very much in terms of the participant attitude towards prosperity. There was a strong sense that in embracing digital innovation and a collaborative approach to a clean energy future, Canadians have shown that they can understand the need of combining complex domestic and international public policy issues when we're looking at economic growth. And in fact, throughout this area, they really seem to see that principles and pragmatism are more complements than contradictions. We saw that very much in the issue of trade, where Canadians showed themselves in the discussions quite supportive of trade and the pursuit of economic opportunities, particularly in the new digital economy, but also more broadly. They're anxious to maintain Canada's ability to trade freely, particularly with the United States. There are cautious, hesitant about China, but supportive of diversification with Asia more generally. Yet at the same time, two of the top 4 areas in terms of importance to Canadians on the voting were again companies' commitment first to human rights issues and Canadian companies' commitment to environmental issues when engaged internationally. So Julia's point of Canadians believing we should be truly walking the talk is clearly reflected in their attitude towards trade and the role of Canadian companies. Similarly, on the question of whether or not Canada should review trade agreements if there's been a change in the democratic nature of a country we're dealing with, or whether there are human rights challenges. Again, the overwhelming Canadians believe it should be a factor, not an overwhelming factor, because they know we're dealing with a challenged, complex world, but it shouldn't be something we simply put aside, but rather we should try to ensure that principles and pragmatisms are intertwined in how we engage internationally. And finally, that's really reflected in how Canadians looked at how we should be engaged in terms of resources to make a difference. There was a sense, yes, we do need to be prepared to invest to help others, but particularly when it's also helping Canadians. So helping others deal with the health and economic consequences of COVID is not only principled, it's pragmatic. Also, a very strong sense of we need to actually be able to show results. So over 80% supported a well-funded security, particularly with enhanced transparency. There was strong support for key elements of global health, as Julia mentioned, particularly on the issues for developing countries on global health and supporting the COVID recovery. On diplomacy, there was certainly a support for the engagement and the importance of diplomacy. There was more skepticism on the role of additional new global strategies and additional new ambassadorial positions or embassies per se. I think Canadians weren't in the comments rejecting those. They were rather saying, how can we link those to real results? And overall, there was the sense of we need to walk the talk, we need to practice what we preach, we need to make sure our statements abroad are consistent with our actions at home, and we need to do it perhaps with a greater sense of humility and self-awareness. And really overall, the idea is we should engage not to make a scene, but to make a difference, not to show the flag, but to show results. And that was the type of principled pragmatism that we got across different geographies and across partisan perspectives from these 444 Canadians involved in this process. Turn it back to you, Ben.
Un gros merci pour tous nos panélistes et présentateurs. Nous avons reçu quelques questions des journalistes. Alors, j'aimerais tourner le microphone à vous, les membres des médias, tout de suite. N'oubliez pas de mettre votre nom et votre agence de médias dans le chat. Et nous allons répondre, nous allons enlever on va c'est quoi unmute en français? On va vous donner la parole pour poser la question. So please, if you're interested in asking a question, put your name and agency in the chat line. And I'd also ask you that you keep your questions concise. We may turn to several people to answer. So first, I'll turn over to Charmaine, who's managing the lineup of journalists, to let us know who the first question will come from.
Thank you, Ben. The first question will be from Hannah Hett from Open Canada. Go ahead, Hannah. We will unmute you. Just one moment.
Good morning. Yeah, so my first question is, what were the factors that contributed to the 10% increase in the faith in the system of Canada's democracy throughout the deliberative democracy process? Thank you.
Oh, that's a good one. And I think for these more general questions, I might turn to Anne and Lisa if they might have some speculation about why you saw that increase in faith in democracy. Anne? Or Lisa, whatever. Like
I will come
Issue, yeah.
I'll have mute. Well, look, I think speculating on that, I think the whole process, right, was one where people first were informed. They were given information that they could take on board and think about and reflect on and ask questions from a trusted group of experts if they had questions. And then when they actually engaged with each other, they, I think, absolutely were encouraged to be respectful of each other, take on each other's points of view, talk them through. I was actually surprised because I quietly watched in the corner as an observer on a couple of the discussions. In fact, very interactive, but very respectful, sharing each other's views based on the information they had. And I think all of that goes together to create a context in which people are respectful and they seek compromise because they see the value of working with each other, and they actually end up in these even relatively small exercises caring about each other.
Yeah, and piggybacking, I agree with Anne completely, and piggybacking on that, I think maybe perhaps people were surprised that the reality of discussing an issue isn't what it's like in social media writ large. It's not that instantaneous attack of one another where somebody finally retreats and goes off and doesn't continue to engage. This allowed them, and in fact, kind of made them stay in the room to have the conversation. And what I'm hoping, I can't speak for the participants, but what I'm hoping they felt was that they looked at the deliberations as an example of our other institutions where this kind of deliberation takes place, and they saw the benefit of it, and they thought, okay, well, maybe our other institutions aren't as bad either. They're not as bad as I think they are. People can get along. So I'm hoping that's what it is, but it's only in the minds of those 444 to tell us why they moved, but I'm glad that they did.
Well, I might ask Jim Fishkin if he could offer some comparative perspective here, having run similar exercises in 30 countries. Have you seen these kinds of results in other countries, Jim?
Yes, to a considerable degree. I think when people think their voice matters and they open up and learn to listen to each other, the whole process takes on legitimacy, and the sponsors and the take on legitimacy as well. People move beyond a soundbite and the attack ads and tropes of social media, and they find out that there are real people with human concerns on the other side of those issues. And so I think that relates to the increase in trust, mutual respect, and legitimacy. Let me make a comment about this, just to a couple of comments about the broader project. I'm really, I promise just to be an observer, but I can't help express my enthusiasm for working with this wonderful team of Canadians and Canadian institutions. But what you did had some uniqueness to it. Elements of this, sorry, there's a lawnmower outside. I can't. Elements of this have occurred in other deliberative polls, but you put all the elements together in a wonderful way under the challenging conditions of COVID. First, note, it's not just a deliberative poll. It's not just a poll before and after. It's a national controlled experiment. So this has great social science internal validity. That is, you had the 444 people who deliberated, and you had 300 who took the same questionnaire before and after, and they didn't change significantly at all. So you know that's evidence that the changes were due to the deliberation and not something else going on in the world. So as a controlled experiment, you not only have the quantitative data, but you have all the transcripts of the small group discussions. And that puts a human face on the changes and on the reasons people brought to their changes. And so that helps in our deliberative quest to find out the reasoning of the people and why they changed or did not change. The other thing I want to say is that the proposals that didn't change are as interesting as the ones that did, because imagine that before deliberation, you take a survey and you just have an impression of sound bites and headlines and you offer an answer. But then after you go through this extensive process, you've heard all the arguments on either side. You've shared reasons with all the people in a diverse group, because a random sample randomly assigned is also a random sample. And so you've encountered the reasoning of other people who disagree with you. And then if you offer the same answer at the end, it's been tested by adverse opinion. It's a considered judgment instead of an impression. And it's those considered judgments that we think should be an input to the public dialogue and to policymakers when they're willing to listen. I also want to acknowledge that YouGov was our survey research partner in this, and they did an excellent job. They got a representative sample of deliberators, and it was matched to a representative sample in the control group. And so it's a rigorous social science project. And so I'm hoping that the people who know, and the reason that you're making the presentations rather than me is that you know the Canadian context and you know what's interesting and what's not. But I'm hoping that the people who know will see this as unusual and meritorious. Oh, and also there are two other things that you did that were really great. I've been saying for years that I would like to have some deliberative crowdsourcing from the people in the agenda setting. So you had a distinguished group of experts setting the agenda for the questions, but the CIC, with Ben Roswell's leadership, engaged CIC chapters in different parts of the country who deliberated in a preliminary way with the first draft of the materials, and they made suggestions about what was left out or what could be improved, and those were incorporated into the final agenda. And that's different from just ordinary crowdsourcing because it was the groups arriving at a recommendation that they discussed together. And all of that was done with our new technology, which we sometimes call the automated moderator, but it's really a mechanism, as Julia said, that allows a group to moderate its own discussions without a human moderator who might be biased. But the automated moderator controls the access to the talking time. Nobody speaks for more than 45 seconds at a time. It makes sure that everybody gets to talk. It asks the participants if they've adequately discussed the pros and cons on each issue before they move to the next. And it even intervenes if people are uncivil. And I don't think there were any uncivil interventions in Canada. Canadians are nice, just as I always thought they were. But in some countries, it's intervened a little bit. I think, so I think that this is a really a path-breaking, unique exercise in public deliberation on a national scale. And so years ago, we did a local deliberation in Nova Scotia on energy issues. But I've always wanted to return to Canada. It's been a couple of decades. And to return to Canada on a national scale with this unique experiment is really something I'm very happy about.
Well, we were very impressed with the innovations and happy to see how they contributed to the exercise. Over to Charmaine for our second question from a journalist.
Awesome, thank you. Now we have a question from Brennan McDonald from CBC. Go ahead, Brennan.
Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Thanks for taking questions. I want to pose this question to Ms. Raitt and Ms. McClellan, and I want to zero in on the results around the annual mandatory contributions to the WHO. The pre-deliberation result and the post-deliberation result showed a majority support for increasing mandatory contributions to the WHO. That stood out to me just given the controversy that agency has courted over the course of the pandemic, from Trump's attacks to questions about its relationship with China. I just wanted to get both of you on, on that result. Does it surprise you? And what do you think the Canadian government should take from it?
Well, let me say that I'm not surprised that a majority of Canadians would think that support, financial and otherwise, for the WHO is a good thing. Yes, there obviously during COVID, and I'm a former federal health minister, I dealt with SARS. There were lots of controversies at that time around the WHO as well. But I think overall, that Canadians understand, as been said earlier, that a global pandemic is just that, it's global, and that Canada working alone cannot protect its citizens. And therefore, we need to be part of a larger global enterprise, and the WHO is one of the vehicles by which we participate in that, that global reaction and approach to something like a global pandemic. I think in the results, though, you also see that Canadians think that there are things that we should be trying to do better as Canadians in terms of influencing the WHO. But I don't think it's surprising that Canadians overall see the benefit of participating in a global entity like the WHO, especially when the discussion was taking place in the middle of a global pandemic.
Yeah, what I would say is I don't know if I had any preconceived notions on where Canadians sat on it, but noting the results, I hope one of the outcomes of this process is that policymakers and politicians and news reporters will talk about what the deliberation rendered, which was very interesting for the time and place in which the deliberations took place, as Anne pointed out. So I mean, as I said, I didn't have a line of sight into what Canadians felt in general about the WHO, and that's why something like this is important. And remember as well, the process was such that they were briefed up almost as if they were a cabinet minister. And I would say, I mean, that the briefs that they received, the ability to ask questions, it was like sitting in the seat as a minister where you receive briefings and you make decisions and you ask questions and you come forward with what your final deliberation is. And that's the process that average Canadians were actually exposed to. And they have indicated what their decision is on WHO. And as Anne pointed out, it's more nuanced than just saying yay or nay WHO. There's stuff in there that they as well, because as we know, it's not black and white, guys. There's a lot of gray in all of this.
Thank you, Lisa. We're going to circle back to follow-up questions if we have time at the end, but we have quite a lineup going on here. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael Petru from Open Canada, and then next up will be Jordan Gowling from CTV.
Hi, thank you very much, everybody. I have a question regarding, I mean, the report, of course, recommends regular exercises in deliberative democracy for governments and for society. I mean, I'm wondering how these can be set up in a way that political parties and especially parties in power will buy in, because it seems to me that there's risks in this exercise. You might get results you don't want. I'm thinking this was not a deliberative democracy exercise, it was a consultative process. But the recent Liberal consultation regarding electoral reform, for example, the exercise may produce results that run counter to your agenda, your plans. So it's risky, and I'm wondering how governments might overlook or overcome or judge that these risks are outweighed by the benefits. How do you get buy-ins from governments and political parties? Is the short version of my question.
I think this is really about the political world. Maybe we can do it in a reverse order this time. Maybe start with Lisa.
Yeah, sure. So the way I approach this, and I think the conversations that we had on the advisory committee was that the outcomes weren't to be seen as pieces of information for policies to be hung on by saying, aha, see, we were right or they were wrong. That's not the outcome of this. The outcome of this is when Canadians are provided with information, the ability to ask questions, they deliberate, they come away with their decision making. And it's very interesting what their deliberations render. And what my hope is that people who are in the business of creating public policy will look at these results, both for the process and for what the results were given the time in which the questions were asked. Because I think it is rich information, and I think it is something that can inform good public policy decision-making. Now, the big question is, will a political party want to give a call to Dr. Fishkin and say, hey, I really want to use your platform. I really want to understand. Well, that would take place, that would almost take the place of door knocking in one way, shape, or form, getting what Canadians feel all in one area. But it's going to be up to them. I think the benefit of what the organizations have done in bringing this to Canada is to at least show people that it can work. And that's kind of the process side of it. Me was very intrigued by the issue of it. As a former politician, would I want to utilize it? I don't know. I think that's something for the parties to think about. But I do think public policymakers and government should look at it as a valid way of getting information. I think it was helpful. It's better than round tables, Anne. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, Absolutely. I agree with everything Lisa's just said. But let me say, Michael, that I think consultations, whether they're of this form or others, you never know what the results are going to be. So you either go into them, take them on, knowing that you are going to hear things potentially that don't fit with your idea or your policy agenda as a political party or as a minister. So I guess the answer is don't do them unless you take on board and realize that when Canadians speak, they may not agree with you.
Yeah.
And then you have to, as a responsible politician, you then have to take that on board and say, maybe humility requires me and my government and my party to rethink what we thought was the right public policy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And our next question is from Jordan Gowling from CTV. Jordan, I think
You still seem to be on mute there, Jordan.
Jordan, you have to accept the request to unmute yourself.
While we're waiting, maybe we could ask one of the follow-on questions.
Yes, so maybe back to Brennan McDonald, if you have any follow-up questions. Brennan, are you able to come off mute? Try and we might be having some issues here. There we go. Brennan?
Sorry, I was like triple muted. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, my last question is just on, on the idea of deliberative polling here, and sort of what you would say to maybe critics of it, because it's not a traditional poll, and participants are provided with carefully balanced briefing materials, and they have the opportunity to direct questions at an expert panel. Like, what do you say to those that would be concerned that the study is not truly representative of the views of Canadians, of like standard everyday Canadians who haven't been briefed?
I wonder if we might turn to Robert for that one.
Yeah, so I guess what this is, I think, is one more instrument, one more sort of spotlight to shine on what Canadians believe about international engagement, what they think is important. And in a sense, focus groups and polling provide that perspective you were talking about of Canadians who have the information they've picked up through social media or everyday interaction. And you can ask them, what do you think on these issues? What this does is says, well, let's take that group of Canadians, again, scientifically chosen to be as representative as possible, with these two additions. One is to provide them with some briefings in terms of facts and materials, trying to have them as balanced as possible, with a champions group that itself was balanced in terms of advice to us, to try to make sure that the process had integrity, and then to provide that 8 to 12 hours of discussion and debate. So as Professor Fishkin was saying, this isn't people's opinions, this is their considered judgment after being exposed to this information and this discussion. So that then provides you with a different perspective on how Canadians are seeing these things. And one can compare that considered perspective and judgment with what the polling and focus groups were saying. And as Professor Fishkin was saying, where they're the same, that's actually very powerful, because that means Canadians deeply believe this perspective. Where there are significant differences from the ingoing and the outgoing perspective, that means that there's perhaps a certain collective dissonance and an opportunity or a need for leaders to engage with Canadians on those issues. So I don't think we would say this is the only and the perfect way of intervening. We think this is a very valuable additional perspective. And what's interesting is that was the takeaway of the participants themselves. In the polling where they were asked, were the briefings useful, the discussions useful, do you think this was useful? 80 to 90% said they found this a very positive exercise. So we think it's one thing that has shown its merits, and we hope will be adopted in an ongoing fashion. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Go ahead, Jordan. Jordan, do you want to go ahead with your question? I think we're having some technical difficulties on Jordan's end.
Not muted this time.
No?
Could Jordan put his question in the chat?
Yeah, that might be a good idea. Jordan, if you can type your question in the chat, we should be able to see it.
While we're waiting, I might put Julia on the spot for an answer to that last question as well, since we've had quite a lot of internal discussions between the three partners about the value of this exercise. Love to hear your views, Julia.
Yeah, I mean, Brennan, just on a process point, so the participants don't receive the briefing material until after the first poll. So it is essentially a poll first, and then they go through the deliberation with the briefing materials, etc. So in that way, I think, you know, it has that sort of validity. Other arguments against the process is, you know, that they don't necessarily have enough access to the expertise. They're talking through issues quite quickly, etc. And my observation in watching and observing was that wasn't the case. You know, like everyone was participating. I was quite concerned that women or those who, you know, minorities in other ways would not participate as much, that the conversations would be dominated by the typical voices that dominate foreign policy conversations in expert circles as well. And I was astounded to discover that that was not the case. So young people, women, persons of color, Indigenous Canadians were actively engaging in the conversation alongside all others. And so to me, that's really fascinating, because you're not getting that level of nuance when you're just doing a poll. You just simply can't understand who is saying what for why. So I found that really fascinating. And we have Jordan's question now here.
That's great. Shall I read it out, Charmaine?
Go ahead.
It says, hi from Ms. Raitt and Ms. McLennan. You're releasing this democracy exercise to mark Canada Day, but Canada has come under a lot of scrutiny globally for its treatment of Indigenous people. Many municipalities have canceled Canada Day celebrations. What do you think of this, and what impact does it have on Canada's global brand? Over to you, Lisa.
Sure. Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, that's a very tough question, Jordan, to be honest. The process that we've been involved in with deliberations with the 444 and the process that was brought to Canada, specifically on foreign policy, really did culminate with this timing of releasing at this point in time. When I noted in my opening remarks that we're at Canada Day on the horizon, I do think it's important to note that what Dr. Fishkin said, which is Canadians are nice. I mean, that is one of the things that we talk about. However, I also believe that what we have illustrated and shown through this process is that when presented with the facts, with the ability to discuss, they will do so respectfully, and they will do so in a way in which there is dignity in the conversations, and they seek to compromise. And if there's anything we can pull from this process and deliberation that gives me hope for what we're about to face as a nation together with respect to Indigenous issues, is that at the heart and at the base of who we are as Canadians, we do want to work together to get to the right place. So perhaps that's a bit of a Pollyannish approach to what I see coming out of the process, but this deliberation gave me hope that we can collectively work together as Canadians and make tough decisions and face tough issues together.
I agree. And I think also what you see reflected in these results, and Jordan, if one looked at the transcripts, I think humility. And humility is going to be important as we as a nation go forward and work on some very painful parts of our history, and how we acknowledge that and how we work together to have meaningful reconciliation and healing. So for me, I think Canada Day is a day to celebrate our country, but now especially this Canada Day is a day to think about parts of our past that so many Canadians were not fully aware of. They weren't fully informed. And what is this deliberative exercise about? Part of it is about better informing Canadians so that we can share together and learn together and make the better choices for our country. So I actually think, to Lisa's point, that this process may be one tool, as Robert has said, to help us all learn more and come together and deal with, among other things, some really painful, difficult parts of our past. So I think Canada Day is a day to acknowledge that we have, in many respects, accomplished great things, but that we also have to acknowledge, I would say, failures and a lack of and an inability to inform ourselves around important parts of our past. And going forward, we need to listen a lot more and talk to each other a lot more and really understand, I think, what reconciliation can mean. And that I think something like this deliberative democracy exercise could help us all in coming together.
I'd like to give the last word to Julia here, because indeed the subject of the rights of Indigenous people came up really quite frequently in the discussion between our 444 participants. And since Julia was our expert on the Dignity chapter, perhaps she could offer some reflections.
Yeah, I was heartened to see that there were places in which in the security agenda there were several questions where we talked specifically to Indigenous issues, and we're trying to ask questions and to dig. But in reviewing the transcripts, Indigenous issues of poverty, inequality, and resilience, like on both sides of the equation, was organically raised by group after group after group. And for me, as someone who works in the international development space, is looking at global goals, this was an incredibly eye-opening experience to say that I no longer will talk about over there without talking about here. And I mean, I'm really committed to that personally, but because of this exercise and for many other reasons. But it's this idea that foreign policy and what we do on the dignity front, or even within the global health space, that we need to walk the talk in Canada. And that desire for consistency was across, it was across political stripes, it was across all jurisdictions within Canada. I mean, this came up that we cannot go talking about things on the global stage that we are not making a good faith effort for around here. And that was such a strong conclusion. And I think that really needs to shift the way we think about foreign policy as its own issue area, and the way that we think about international development work and et cetera, and talk about how are the issues of drinking water here in Canada connected to the issues of drinking water in Tanzania? How can we connect, build up best practices, and be having sort of a consistency of approach, et cetera. So I was really heartened to see the way that Canadians are putting this issue on the agenda consistently. They're interested, and I now think it's up to policymakers and us within civil society to say, yes, we heard that, we hear you loud and clear, and we're gonna take that forward.
Thank you so much to you, Julia. Thank you to Anne and Lisa for presenting this report, to our partner, Robert, Jim Fishkin, who had to jump off, and to those of you that bared with us for a little longer here. We've gone a bit over time because of the rich discussion and the many questions. Just a reminder, you can find the report of our conclusions of foreign policy by Canadians on the CIC website or the CanWatch website. The links have been posted here. Vous pouvez trouver le rapport sur les sites web du CIC et de CanSFE. Si vous avez d'autres questions à poser, nous avons mis l'adresse courriel de Charmaine. C'est crockett@canwatch.ca. So any follow-up questions, please send them to Charmaine. The email is there in the chat line, and we'd love to field them. And a final note, we'll just mention that the Toronto chapter of our organization, CIC, will be hosting a first deep dive into some of the results at 5 p.m. today, and particularly the Human Dignity chapter, with the author of those questions and some of the experts that engage with citizens in order to unpack what Canadians have told us for this exercise. And you can look forward to events of that kind throughout the summer and the fall, hosted by CIC chapters from coast to coast. So thank you once again to my partners in this historic exercise, to our champions, and to all of us, all of you that joined us today. Merci, au revoir, miigwech.
Thanks, everyone.